Hello and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define your family. And today I am with Chrysta Bilton, who is an author, just published the book Normal Family, and talk about the many ways to create a family. Chrysta's family, which is the subject of her book, is one of the most interesting family dynamics I have yet to hear, and it was one of the most beautifully written books I have yet to read. Highly recommend it. In this case, Chrysta's mom found her biological father, convinced him to become a sperm donor, and then he did this as a career. He sort of became a career donor. He's been written about in a number of news articles because it was later discovered that he had schizophrenia, and that has a huge impact on her many brothers and sisters, donor-conceived siblings. That's only one part of this story, and it's maybe the one that has the biggest news headlines and the flashiest elements. And it's certainly one that brings up a lot of ethical questions about the donor conception world and the donor conception industry. But beyond that is a story of Chrysta's mom, who is one of the first lesbian solo moms to really put herself out there and say, I know that there's not a lot of examples of lesbian women having families, but I'm going to do this. I want to have a family and I'm going to go out and do it on my own. And she did anything necessary, including meeting a man in a hair salon to become her donor. It's also the story about how to navigate life's ups and downs as a child when the world around you is changing so rapidly. In Chrysta's case, her mom ended up dating a lot of women, and the ins and outs of those relationships, the ups and downs, the beginnings of endings, had a huge impact on Chrysta. So we've got this multi-layered book about Chrysta's mom and her very, very bold life, Chrysta's relationship to her mom and to her many second mothers, her relationship to her father, and her relationship to her donor-conceived siblings. There's so much. I don't want to give away any of the details, either in the episode or in the book. You just have to listen and read both. Highly recommend the book. And if you love this episode, and I'm certain you will, don't forget to leave a great review wherever you listen to podcasts. Be sure to follow us on social media. Be sure to pick up Chrysta's book and share it with a friend. Here's Chrysta. I really hope you enjoy it. So, Chrysta, I am absolutely thrilled. We've got so much to talk about, all things donor conception and family building and what is family. And so welcome to Stork'd, the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. Can you tell us who you are? Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive into your story.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I just wrote a book called Normal Family on truth, love, and how I met my 35 siblings. It's probably a lot more than 35. I think we're up to like 42 now. And the book, it's two stories. One is how in my mid-20s, I discovered that the man I had known as dad was actually paid to father me and then brought into my life as a father figure. But then after me had turned to sperm donation as a career and donated sperm up to 3 times a week for almost 10 years, which meant that I had anywhere from several dozen to possibly hundreds of biological siblings growing up all over the US. So the book tracks that story. And then it's also the story of my unconventional and what people might call dysfunctional upbringing with my larger than life gay mom in the 80s and 90s. Sort of the quick origin story of how I came into the world was that, as I said, my mom identified as a lesbian in the 1980s, and she didn't know anyone in her community who had started a family. But she felt this burning desire to have a kid. And so she sort of set out. I think even now it's unusual, as you did, to like be a single mother by choice and like go out and have a kid. But back then she just had no examples. It was incredibly taboo and there was a lot of stigma around it. So she went on what was essentially a manhunt for a sperm donor. And my dad walked into a Beverly Hills hair salon and was the most handsome man she'd ever seen. And she said to herself, that's the one. That's going to be the man who I take out to lunch and pay $2,000 to give me a cup of his sperm so that I can inseminate myself with a turkey baster and have my baby.
It's so amazing. For starters, $2,000 is a tremendous amount of money in the 80s.
Crazy amount of money. I don't know where she thought of that number. She was doing well that month. Didn't always do well, but at that moment, she was doing well.
And it's interesting to me that this is in Southern California because as I've explored family building, it seems like there was this underground network of gay intended parents or people who wanted to be parents in the San Francisco area. And there were these classifieds and ways to connect in and do sperm donation so that it wouldn't be like pulling a stranger off the street. But yet everywhere else in the world, you had to do exactly that. You had to sort of get really creative in the family building process. It's ballsy of her to just pick a stranger.
Yes. The book is really about my mom because she's ballsy in a whole bunch of other areas as well, and also totally out of her mind, but in the best way possible. So she paid him, but what he didn't understand, and maybe she didn't fully understand, is that she had more plans for him than just this transaction. So the reason I call him my dad is because after I was born, my mother had this, and I tell this scene in the book, she had a panic attack at the hospital when she needed to sign her name and then saw this blank line where the father's name signature was meant to go. And she called him frantically from the hospital and she said, you have to come, you have to sign the birth certificate. Like, I think my kid is this blank hole in their life is going to be a big deal. And I need at least your signature on the line so they know where they come from. Because she just had so much shame about doing this in this different way and worried how it would affect me. So he came to the hospital and that was him signing up for way more than he expected. After that, she then started paying him to play a role in my life. And I knew him as dad.
Okay, so would you mind if we talk about a couple of these moments? And I know to some extent it's a little unfair because you're telling somebody else's story and it relates to your story. I mean, we're going to talk about how you feel about these things, but there's a moment where your dad's perception, self-perception, self-identity shifts from, I've done this one-time transaction and isn't that lovely and I've helped somebody out, presumably, to what? Now I'm a dad. Do you know anything? Has he talked to you about that moment of perception shift, self-identity shift?
Yeah, I talked to him extensively. There were a couple things in there to answer that question. So in addition to my mom paying him to do this, she made him swear that he would never do it for anyone else. And at the time, he remembers laughing to himself because it wasn't like every day he walked into a hair salon and a woman offered to pay him for his sperm. It's like, of course, I'm not going to make a career out of this. But, a week later, she took him to what was then the very beginnings of the California cryobank, but it was a fertility clinic, to have him tested for STDs and his fertility. And it was then that he was sitting getting his blood drawn that he looked out the window with the door cracked and saw these men giving donations. And it occurred to him, oh, that's why she made me swear, because she knew she was going to take me here and I might get this idea. So she introduced him to the sperm trade, really. And he broke his promise, but secretly. So in this next decade that he was giving sperm and playing the role of my in and out father, she didn't know that he was doing this. They both tell the story of that hospital visit. And basically he came and he felt really awkward about it. My mother is a bulldozer. When she wants something, she sort of gets it. And my father is a little bit more fragile and passive. And so that mix between the two, she would just pushed him in and he just couldn't really resist. And he gets to the hospital and he sends my birth certificate and she has him carry me. And she describes this very intense feeling of connection between him and this is their child. And he describes feeling completely more awkward than he's ever felt in his life. He's got all of my mom's friends staring at him. He imagines they're all thinking, oh, he must feel this deep connection to this baby. And meanwhile, all he's thinking is, God, how do I get out of here as fast as possible? So then he would show up to the house for a visit when I was an infant. And he would describe my mother saying, oh, Chrysta, look, it's daddy. Say hi to daddy. Give a hug to daddy. And he describes being like, it's not daddy, it's Jeffrey. I didn't sign up for this. So there's a lot of comedy in it, but also I feel for both of my parents in that situation. Like he did not know what he was signing up for. And I also think my mom felt a lot of shame around not giving me the traditional family at that time when that was everywhere. And she didn't see other examples of how family could be built.
It's amazing because I think I expected to feel that shame personally. Going into a solo parenting journey, I think I expected to feel a little embarrassment or being on the part of like, he doesn't have a dad. But because it's so normalized these days, or at least I'm working through the podcast and you're working through your book and others are working in other mechanisms to normalize it, the shame doesn't hit me or resonate. But your heart does break for those people who felt it or continue to feel it.
Yeah. It's like, I think the time was such a big piece of that. There just were no examples of alternate family. But also, I think that as I get in the book, since it's really about the story of me and my mother, is like, she had a really tough upbringing, even though she had a traditional family in the sense that she had like heterosexual parents who stayed together. She had a pretty dark childhood, even if there was a lot of love there. Like both of her parents had extreme alcoholism. Her dad had PTSD from having been in war. He ultimately committed suicide, which is something I didn't learn until late in life. And my mother then struggled throughout my upbringing with drug addiction and a bunch of other up and down economic situations. She couldn't stay in a relationship for more than 2 years, even though some of her partners were wonderful. So I think that shame probably had something to do with perhaps you come into being a parent in an already more healed place. I think that regardless of charting this new territory, even if she had not been gay, I think that raising kids would have brought complications for her.
Yeah, I want to go back to your story, but I think that's one of the most important pieces of advice I give anyone who is asking, which direction should I go with my journey, is try to be healed as much as you can before going to embark on family building in any way, shape, or form, but especially on your own. Let's talk about being healed, because this is the first time I've met you. And what I'm witnessing is somebody who is pretty grounded in describing your parents' emotional reactions to holding a baby and to navigating parenting and navigating their relationships. But the baby they're holding is you, right? And so sometimes I think we as children have to hold space for our complicated parents in a way that makes us not have as much room for our own emotions. When you were talking to your mom and talking to Jeffrey, your dad, you're hearing them describe their complex relationships with you. How did that feel on the first time you heard that story?
Now I'm at peace with it and I can even find humor in it. But I think that at different times in my life, it was harder. I get into in the book is that my father struggled with some very serious mental health issues, and he wound up being homeless and with a schizophrenia diagnosis. And so that's a heavy part of the story. And both for me personally as knowing him as dad, but then for the genetic component of that. But also in reporting out the book, the truth is that for a lot of my life, I didn't know the real story. So I was told that my parents had been best friends who had a kid together.
So we've now got 3 versions of a story. We've got Jeffrey's version, we've got your mom's version, and we've got this.
And then the version I was told. And even though cracks slipped in my mom's story throughout the years, and I maybe came to understand that it was more complicated, until I reported out this book. The book is really sort of like a mystery of like what really happened. And then I was trying to hear my dad's version and my mom's version and remember my own version, which, as you said, is sometimes hard when you're giving space for your parents' realities, like coming to your own truth. But in the reporting out of the book, my dad told me very nonchalantly one afternoon that in addition to paying him for his sperm, which at that point I had uncovered already, my mother had paid him to come over for birthday parties and Christmases, and that they called it a donation. So even though I had in my 20s, after the discovery of the siblings and his donor life, even though I'd come to understand that my mom paid him originally, I then had this illusion that he then was involved because he wanted to be or something. But then to understand that at least part of it was financially motivated, that was a hard truth to grapple with.
I bet.
And then it was hard for me to be like, well, do I continue giving him the father label? Or do I just revert to he was my sperm donor? Labels are such an interesting thing. Some donor conceived children who have read the book are like, but why does she keep calling him dad? And I'm like, from the time that scene I described of him holding me, is like, here's daddy. That was very ingrained in me.
Wow. Okay. So there's so much here. And how has your relationship with Jeffrey, with dad, evolved since you found out that he was for a period of time getting paid to step into the role of father?
Well, I think I'm now in a place of having a lot of compassion for him. I also have been able to remove myself of feeling the burden of trying to save him or change his life, because I think that what that label of dad made me feel just this tremendous burden of how do I help his situation. He's now living in his car, and it's not an ideal situation, even though when I talk to him, he seems to really like his life the way it is. And he has a lot of wild conspiracy theories. So anytime I try and help him with housing, he's like, well, the world's going to end next week. So this is just temporary. And so there's nothing you can really do with that. But I think that I've come to peace with it because we know so much more about mental health stuff. And also through the book, I came to really know my parents as people and understand their own childhood traumas. And it's not that he had deep relationships with other people and then had this financially incentivized one with me. Like, he has trouble with people in general. And that's so sad. It's so sad. And so I think that adage, like, your parents did the best they could with the tools they had, like, I think that's really true in this case. And I just feel sad for him that, like, he just doesn't have a lot of close relationships. With animals, he has deep relationships, but with humans, he has a harder time.
Do you love him?
Yes, I do love him a lot.
I'm noticing that you have a ring on your left finger. Are you in a significant relationship?
Yes, I'm married and have 2 kids. It's a traditional family with a non-traditional extended family. So we still have my crazy mom, who I'm very close with, who's an active grandma, and then my little sister, who's an active aunt. And then these biological siblings are sort of in the picture a little bit. And then lots of people in our lives who are not biologically related, but who I consider family.
And I want to talk about the siblings in a minute, but what's running through my head and why I asked it and putting myself in your shoes is that I imagine learning the complexities of your family origins and how you came to be and how these dynamics played out. Personally, I imagine I might have a complicated relationship with love. And yet you're in a healthy, thriving, happy relationship with 2 kids. How have you navigated holding all this information? Has it impacted your relationship with your partner? Has it impacted your relationship with your kids? Have you had to do any work in your relationship with yourself?
A tremendous amount. And that's a great intuition because it's true. For most of my life, I was attracted both in friendship and love to incredibly abusive partners. And so I've been in one incredibly physically abusive and dangerous relationship I was in on and off for almost 10 years. And I tell that story in the book, actually, with someone who I ultimately think also had mental illness, which is interesting. And in some weird way is kind of a replica of my dad, minus the violence. Because my father was gentle, he wasn't violent. And then even in friendships, I sought out women who had like mentally abusive tendencies. Because, to backtrack, it wasn't just my relationship with my dad, but my relationship with my mom was very complicated because I became her mother from basically like 10 years old on. And she cycled through, she was sober and then doing drugs and alcohol. Some readers have reached out and been like, it was like you were an army brat, but in Los Angeles, because every 2 years we would move to a new house and we'd change families because I'd have these second mommies, is what I would call them, who I would become very attached to. And then they would go on vacation, which was my mom's way of breaking up with women. She would tell me that they'd gone on vacation and they'd be coming back in a couple weeks to bring me a gift. And then I just never see these people again. My view of what my family was changing all the time, in addition to my dad. So I was attracted to, I think, sort of narcissistic personalities, drug addict personalities. And I think that sometime around the discovery of the siblings, I think to counterbalance the chaos, I became like a great student and I worked very hard on my outside presentation. So in a perfectionistic way that was probably very unhealthy, I became anorexic bulimic. But people probably looked at my grades and the way I presented and thought that and no one had any idea what was happening at home. So people probably thought, oh, everything's fine with Chrysta. But I hit this emotional bottom my last year of college and out of this horrible relationship. And I started a many-year process of doing a ton of work on myself. So the last piece of that was working on relationships and what I was attracted to in people. And I'm so grateful to say that I really healed in that area. Like I have really rich, deep, healthy relationships now, but that wasn't easy.
Oh, I can imagine. I'm hearing your story. So many parts that are just so relatable, even if the dynamics that you're describing are so specific and unique, right? Trying to parent a parent who needs a little extra because they've got a lot going on in their lives. And it sounds like both of your parents needed a little extra parenting, and trying to experience perfection or stability or create that for yourself I think we can all relate to that on some levels.
Yeah, that's what I hope. I love memoir as a genre. I feel like you just relate so much to people's stories, even if you don't expect to at first glance.
Absolutely. And podcasting is a little bit like a micro memoir. You get it like an hour of somebody's time, but memoir as a genre for books is one of my favorites. It's just so beautiful. So let's talk about the book for a second, because if I'm hearing you correctly, the discovery of the siblings happened sort of concurrent to writing the book, or did that happen before writing the book?
No, so I discovered in my so I'm now 37. And so I discovered the siblings in my early 20s. I think I was 22. And when I first discovered the siblings, it was way too much for me. I was like, this is weird. I already have a really off the charts, bizarre family situation. I can't handle the idea of one new family member, let alone the dozens that are meeting on Facebook right now. It was too much. When one of them reached out to me shortly after me learning about them, I said, I want nothing to do with this. And I'm so happy you guys are meeting and having these connections, but it's just too much for me. So it was almost 10 years before I talked to any of them and really even thought about it. So I was doing a lot of that personal work that I described and just trying to get a stable footing underneath me in life. And then it was only in this really wild set of circumstances a few years ago that I became more open to this larger biological family and embraced ultimately many of them. But that was a long process.
You have a little sister who is a full biological sibling from your mom.
That's right.
I'm curious. It seems to me like there's two paths. There's the family, you and your sister, who know Jeffrey as dad for all the various reasons that he was in your life. And then the other set of siblings now, I'd say, 33, 35, some odd that.
I think we're up to 40 something now, but yes,
40 something. Okay. They must have had a different experience with Jeffrey. They must have had him as a donor number if he was going through the cryobank system. When you connect with them, how do you reconcile those two different experiences?
Yeah, so it is different. Like I'm telling the story of this, in many ways, this bizarre nuclear family. And then I have a little bit of the stories of the siblings who had a much more traditional donor conceived childhood. And it's really interesting, my relationship to watching their journey with Jeffrey as they know him, or donor 150 as it started out. Because in some ways, that's actually wonderful because, not in some ways, in many ways, it's really wonderful because we can all analyze him and the situation together. And it's like I have a group now who all are personally invested in trying to figure out, like, what does he suffer from? And what was his childhood trauma? And how are the ways that we're struggling genetically from his genetic material? And so there's something nice about that. It's almost like if you were to join any group that all share one thing in common, we share this biological history in common. But their relationship to it is very different. It's a lot easier for them to detach from him than it is for me. So there are two groups of the siblings. There are the ones that were raised by single mothers by choice or gay parents where they knew since they could know that they had a donor. And then there's a larger group which grew up with two heterosexual parents who were married where the man was infertile and they secretly used a donor. And so for that group, it's a much harder process because in many cases, they only discovered that they had a donor by accident through taking a DNA test. And I think grappling with that lie is really hard for the kids.
Yeah, that feeling of being deceived. We talked a little bit about this with relationship to Jeffrey's shift in self-perception and your shift in self-perception, but the self-identity question, who am I now that new information has come to light? It's tough.
Yeah. So I feel like coming from a donor, it's a bigger struggle for the kids who had the lie than the ones that just knew the truth from the beginning. But, I also have compassion for the parents that lied because in the 80s and 90s, this was, it's still unconventional, but back then it was something that a lot of parents were deeply ashamed of. And they had questions of like, well, first of all, you have the men who have shame around being infertile in the first place and around their masculinity. And then will this child love me less because they are not my biological progeny? And all these questions that come up. And so I have a lot of compassion for the parent. And also the cryobanks at that time were telling these parents, don't tell your kids. So even the medical advice was not supportive.
You can see yourself in the 80s. You can imagine making a similar choice.
Yes.
Right? Because you couldn't imagine rolling forward to a situation where a child might discover it and feel deceived. Knowing that now, you're going to make different set of choices, of course.
Yeah, 100%. But I think I've also been surprised because for so long I was raised feeling my mother's plight and understanding the feelings of the mom in this situation, setting out to build this family. And now through the siblings, I'm understanding what the journey of a donor conceived child is. And those things are just separate. So that has also been interesting, just that most of them, they do think that there is a benefit in knowing their genetic history to the extent that they can. And they do feel that biology is being raised in the 80s and 90s. I thought nurture was everything.
Yes.
And I've come to appreciate that nature is also important. And that's been fascinating, even as a parent, seeing me and my kids. And in some ways, when I'm struggling with the kids, for example, in something, it's like, oh, not all of this is something I can sort through with parenting. I also have to accept that they sort of came in this way and that I can guide it. But yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does, because if you take nurture as the sole thing that drives a human being's development, then the extension is that you have a responsibility, or you can shape that person to be whomever you want. And we're humans. We know we can't be shaped. We are who we are to some extent. We can evolve and grow. If you take the opposite perspective, which is you can't shape somebody, they are who they are, then you have to believe that genetics plays a role. Why are they who they are? It's really complicated.
It's so complicated. Yeah.
And it's not something I fully appreciated until parenting. As you said, like there are days when I'm like, how did you figure this out? How are you this little being who's doing this? And some of it may be me or my parents, his grandparents, or a nanny or somebody who's taught him something. And he's only one, so it's a little bit different. And some of it is just, this is who he is. And I have to appreciate that.
Definitely. And then you have to figure out, if you think like how much you relate to biology, how much you relate to parenting. Is there a spiritual element? Are you a complete atheist? Is there a soul?
Totally. And what my current position is yes to all of those things. Yes, it's biology. Yes, it's nurture. Yes, it's spirit. Yes, it's the universe. And yes, it's like luck and chance. But also, if all of those things are true, then how do my choices shape him? Did I pick the right donor? Doesn't matter whether I pick the right donor. I have a child who's wonderful, but did I like do him justice? It's complicated.
It's so complicated in my way too, because like my mother went on a hunt for the perfect man. This was what she wanted to find. And she found him in the flesh, and he was stunningly beautiful, and his parents had gone to Ivy League colleges, and he also was spiritual, and he played the guitar, and he was like, this was Mr. Perfect. And then he wound up having this private schizophrenia diagnosis and ultimately living in his car in this very eccentric lifestyle. And so you never know what a human being is like. And also, while it's true that maybe ADD is something that's very common with the kids, we're also all highly sensitive. But like most of these kids are thriving and have beautiful lives. And it's not like they're all suffering with mental illness either. There are things that we all struggle with, but there are also gifts we all have. And so genetics is such a mixed bag. I mean, in my husband's family, there's no history of addiction or mental health issues, but heart disease is huge. And so is cancer. And so it's a mixed bag.
Oh, it's so hard to hold all of those things.
It is. And that's when maybe sometimes trusting and all that stuff comes in.
Yeah, I wonder if that's why we as a nation are becoming less religious, but more spiritual. I don't know how to ask this question, and that may be totally off base, but here it is. You have this relationship with Jeffrey, you have this complicated relationship with your mom. And then all of a sudden there are other people who have their own different relationship with Jeffrey. Did you ever have that sense of like, wait a minute, he's mine? This is my thing?
No, but my mother had it to an extreme. So when my mother found out, she sort of in her brain imagined that like he's hers. This is the father of her children. She actually had, which I document in the book in this, very colorful set of chapters, but she had a big mental breakdown when she discovered all the siblings. Like she started walking through West Hollywood, and every time she saw a gay couple holding a stroller, she would stop them and move the blanket and ask if she could see the kid, and then look at the toes and the eyes and be like, I think it's another one. And she ran to find Jeffrey in the coffee shop that he frequents in Venice and told him that he had to marry her that second because otherwise we weren't going to feel special. So she had a lot of it. With me, it was more like, I don't feel any ownership over him. If anything, I'd love is like, oh God, please go visit him on a Thursday night because that I don't have to do it then. If you have an idea for how to get him housed, please run it by me because I don't. But most of the time, they all have a journey with it. I think for the ones that were lied to, often there's initial enthusiasm to understand their biological roots. And especially for the ones that don't have a close relationship, if they were raised with that father or a strained family relationship. Many of those kids come to LA and want to meet Jeffrey I have noticed have a bit of idealization of his lifestyle. Like, oh, he just doesn't want the things that we're trained to want in a capitalist society. And it's really, he's sort of this shaman that's living this simple life. And then they just spend a little more time with him. And then usually the idealization comes down to earth a little bit. And then most of them wind up not having a relationship with him just because he has a tough time with relationships. And then some of them develop bonds with the siblings, some don't. And they just kind of go on living their life. But they treat this as sort of a mecca to understand for their own identity, just putting this puzzle piece in. And it seems to me also that some of the biological siblings, they seem to have a desire to connect with the other siblings more than others. And sometimes that has to do with the closeness of their own family and just this desire for community or friendship. And so I've seen it maybe be less in ones where the fabric of their own family is really strong.
Well, one question I have for you, we started the conversation by talking about the donor conception industry. And I picked up on some words that you said. So at one point you were talking about getting paid to donate and then did call to donation when you talked about Jeffrey looking through and watching people line up to make their donations.
Oh yeah, interesting.
Right. And so you kind of used some different words, sometimes with the more philanthropic perspective of you're helping a family, you're donating, and sometimes with the more commercial perspective. How do you make sense of this donor conception space? How do you make sense of the cryobanks and using other people's sperm to create families?
Well, I think it's so wonderful when people donate because it means that you can facilitate these families. And I think that there could be more checks and balances around the self-reporting from the donors so that you know that medical history is being checked, this kind of thing. Their answers are truthful. Like comically, my father called himself, he said he had a degree in philosophy, but what that really meant was that he had spent a semester at the Transcendental Meditation University. And he called himself a classical dancer, but what that meant was that he was a Chippendales dancer and a stripogram. So he called himself a model, but he was Mr. November 1984 and Playgirl, which all those things spoke to a truth, but they were exaggerations. And so I think that there could be more regulation around the sperm industry. I accidentally, unknowingly dated my brother. That's another big, wild thing that happens. You'll have to read the book for that. So there maybe should be some regulation around how many kids you can have, because then that starts to happen.
Can you give us the 2-second overview of dating your brother?
Yeah. So the only reason that my mom even told me that she had discovered my father's career sperm donor history is because she had learned that I was probably dating my brother. And she had to tell me that, obviously. And it's hard to describe that psychological experience. It was made more complicated. I don't want to give away the whole story because it's a really juicy part of the book, but it was made more complicated by the fact that this boy really was close with his father. And I felt that this news would devastate him. So not only did I need to grapple with the fact of it, but then I couldn't tell him and process it with him because I felt like it was his own family's journey if they were going to tell him. So that was a lot.
That was a lot. That's a little hook, a teaser for definitely take a listen.
Yeah, there's a hook. I don't know. It's so interesting because I was talking to a journalist for the Times in London, and she was talking about how she has a couple different friends who were single moms or gay couples who had actually come to the US to get a sperm donor because the regulation is so stringent in the UK. And that just immediately gave me like, oh, there's some silver lining to there not being a lot of regulation here. So that was just interesting food for thought.
It's interesting because I interviewed somebody who went to Copenhagen to get a sperm donor because the regulation was better there. She felt safer with it. So there's a lot of privilege in sperm donation, and there's a lot of privilege in international travel for sperm donation or the sperm industry.
Yeah. I do think that they have a responsibility to tell parents that the information that they're getting is truthful.
Yes. And to validate and ensure it's truthful.
Yes, to go check. And for example, I don't necessarily fault, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know. Does my father have paranoid schizophrenia? Is he bipolar? He has something. And it turned out, I found out in reporting my book that not only had he had that later diagnosis, but in his early 20s, he'd gone to the Cleveland Clinic with his family and gotten that diagnosis. And that was mentioned nowhere on his report. And he didn't believe the diagnosis to be true. So maybe he was being honest, but that diagnosis did exist somewhere in the world. And there's probably all these HIPAA rules and I don't know what, but it probably wouldn't be that difficult for sperm banks to like have donors release their medical history. So that's something that is important just because, that is a genetic illness.
Absolutely.
But I also don't want to scare new moms that are doing this because
I know
there's so much beauty. I think that the greatest gift that you can give to your children is to want them. And that is something that me and all children who were conceived using a sperm donor have in common, is that they were just like desperately wanted by their parents. And there are so many kids out there that for whatever reason aren't wanted at that particular time, or the parents don't. So I think that's such a magical gift.
I'll go back to you for a second. What was the germinating spark, that thing that made you say, I have to write about my life in this way? I have to write this particular book.
So I had been trying to write the story of just me and my mother's relationship for a really long time, since I was 17. She'd become a cocaine addict in a really heavy way, and she'd gone to get treatment. And I was living alone, sort of parenting my little sister when I was that age, and in this like half-empty office building that was our house at that time. And I didn't know what to do with like my inner life. It was like get into this toxic relationship and start drinking to deal with your feelings. But then I also had this impulse, which I think was a healthier one, which was to make sense of it through writing. So I started trying to write the story then, and then I just couldn't get it together to put it into a form. And in retrospect, I'm so glad, because I did not have any perspective on it then. And it probably would have been something I wouldn't have been proud of to put into the world then. I just had the sense that one day I would write it, and then I would pick it up throughout the years, and then it just wasn't the right time. And then finally, a couple years ago, after the siblings, and then the way that I end up being connected to the half siblings is so bizarre and strange that it just felt like, oh, this is the last piece of the puzzle of why I couldn't write it, because the story was still happening. And it just felt like I'd figured out my ending and I could finally write it. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. It's interesting because there's so many levels to this book and to your life. I almost want to see the original book proposal, because I can imagine, had you just written the story of navigating your relationship with your mom, that in and of itself would be a bestseller. That would be compelling. That would be amazing to read. And yet then we have the Jeffrey relationship, your dad relationship. Then we have the donor sibling relationships. There's so much there. I am not a writer. My mom is, actually. And I have a very hard time on how you even extract all that stuff, how you put it on paper, how you put your heart out there, how you put your life experiences out there. How does it feel now that it's living on its own out in the world?
Oh, I'm really proud of it. And I have a sense of being proud that I finished it, because that was a hard thing for me to do. And then I think what's been really amazing, which was my intuition, but actually experiencing it, was just hearing from readers with a really diverse range of their own stories, just writing to me and talking about the things that they related to. I think that's what's so wonderful about things like this podcast or memoir or other ways that people tell their stories, is just that that's how we often make sense of our own story, is through hearing about other people's journey. So yeah, it's just been wonderful. I'm so grateful that I was able to publish it.
I'm very curious about how you go from that moment of parenting your mom, taking care of your sister, she's away getting treatment, navigating all of the feelings you described, to now having a very connected, you use the word connected, relationship with her. What kind of process did that take? How do you go from the 17-year-old who has a lot of feelings about her mom and her mom's addiction and her mom's relationships, etc., to somebody who now has a woman who's very active in your life, active in your kid's life, and you're very close with?
Yeah, that was a long process. I'd say a huge part of it was like this period of time that I described of realizing that I, in some ways, was becoming my mother. And I was really like, whatever intergenerational cycle of trauma that maybe had started with her dad and the suicide and the drinking and then passed down to her, like it had been passed down to me. And like, there was a certain point where I had to face that I was repeating a lot of the dysfunction myself. And it's not just in abusive relationships, but then I started drinking quite a bit. I was self-medicating with all kinds of addictions. I got sober. I got into like a spiritual program for that. And there was a lot of reflection that came with that. But I think that once I started to change and heal and make better choices that were not necessarily the choices that I had been taught growing up, or the survival tactics that once served me, but then had become very dysfunctional and were not serving me any longer. Like, I think once my life started to change, it was easier to not have that deep resentment that I had and to forgive. Because in a way, you can get so stuck in blaming your parents for your problems. And I certainly did that, but that doesn't really help you in your life. So I think at the point at which I started to take responsibility for my own life and was an adult, and I was like, oh, I can have, for example, my mother had a really complex relationship with money and she loved to spend. And so she would make money through these wild pyramid schemes and then spend it all. And then we would wind up hiding under tables from landlords and then living in a friend's guest house and just the up and down. And then I realized that I was totally repeating this by never committing to I'd always wanted my mom to have a boring, stable job because that would just give us that stability I wanted. But then I couldn't give that to myself. I was like, I have these big dreams that I want to do something I'm passionate about. And for the past 10 years, I've worked at a job doing this consulting that isn't my deepest passion. It's not the writing and the thing I wanted to do, but I gave myself that thing that I wanted my mother to give me. Or why can't my mom stay in a relationship? All the things that I complained about my mom doing, I did ultimately. And when you can understand that that is cyclical and learned and that she learned it somewhere and that you can, to some extent, change it, then I think you're able to heal with your parents because you're not stuck in the mud anymore. I don't know if that makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense. So if I'm a listener and the part of your story that I relate to is a complicated relationship with a parent, whether it's somebody who has mental health issues or drug and alcohol addiction or somebody who can't seem to get well, what advice do you have to someone who's listening and saying, yes, my parents or somebody in my life sounds familiar? How do I navigate those feelings?
It's still complicated with my family. It's not like it doesn't all get tied up with a bow, but I do have a great relationship with my mom. But also she did put in the work to, for example, get sober. So if my mom was an active drug addict right now, I don't know that my advice would be the same because that would be so toxic. I wouldn't be able to have her around my kids or playing an active role. So it's everyone's situation is so unique,
But it sounds like the things that helped you were having a healthy outlet in writing, getting clean, recognizing patterns of behavior, turning to spiritual practices, ultimately meeting somebody that you felt great about. Am I hearing some of the things that might have been either momentous or subtle turning points for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that if I hadn't gotten lucky, I had to change what I was attracted to. And that is really hard.
Yeah.
And I remember a turning point where it's just the beginning. I had just met my now husband and there were other people in the periphery. And I remember being if I stepped out and was looking on this person and I thought who should Chrysta pick to be with? I was it would definitely be this person, but why can't I pick that person? And it's doing a little bit of contrary action to your impulses. Because sometimes those impulses, you can romanticize them or you can pathologize them and be no, that impulse is dysfunctional because you were taught to be attracted to this toxic push-pull and what would it be to try something new? And then maybe the feelings will follow instead of being the thing that's driving you.
I'm hearing you say is taking agency, taking responsibility, taking the time to reflect on what is going on and how I'm responsible for that. Not just my parents, not just genetics or nurture or whatever you want to call it. And then really doing the work of self-parenting, self-healing. I mean, it's a really unfair question. How did you heal your life in 10 minutes?
Oh, no, I remember what I was going to say. Had that person not shown up for me, I probably would have gone down the route that you went down because I had that deep impulse to be a parent. So I also have so much admiration for people like you that are setting out to do it on their own. I think the hard thing for me growing up was that my mom, she got so quickly into these relationships and they moved in and I started calling these women mommy and I loved these women and then they would just disappear after a few years and that was hard. But also it shaped my life in ways I wouldn't have expected. So there was this one woman, Sable. She was my dream second mother, mostly probably because of she was sober and she was really this controlling and neurotic New Yorker who kind of parented my mom in a way that I ultimately would wind up parenting my mother. So maybe I just loved her because of how my mom was in that relationship. But even though her disappearance was really emotionally painful for me, I don't know if I would have ever gone to college in New York had she not instilled this love of New York in me. Or I don't know if I love classic movies and certain music that was all from those 3 years we lived together. So on one hand, I'd be if you have kids, don't bring in a bunch of partners because that's really painful for the kids. But I also was okay at the end. And those things still shaped me. And so I don't know. You can be hard on yourself as a parent as well.
It's true. And there's no hard and fast advice. Do you keep in touch with any of these other mommies?
No, but I have reconnected through the writing of the book with a couple step siblings that were the children of one of the moms. So that's been nice.
So I'm curious, your definition of family, you said this, every couple of years, your family, the shape, who's in it, what it feels like to be in that family unit changes. And then later it just explodes with all these siblings. So you must have a really interesting self-definition of what family is. You've created your own family now. Can you distill for us, reflecting on all those experiences, what family is to you?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. My editor said something that I really love. She was like, family is who belongs to you and who you belong to. And I thought that was really beautiful. I still have different categories of family in my mind. So I now have this biological family. I have my dad, who's his own separate category. And then my main family unit is probably me, my husband, my 2 kids, my eccentric mom, their grandma, and then a couple dear, dear friends, that I gave the label of godparents to my kids. But, it's like concentric circles. You've got the middle, the core, and then it grows from there. But yeah, I think it's such an individual journey what family is for each person.
Definitely agree with that. Definitely. Chrysta, where can we find you? If we want to know more about your story, if we want to find the book, if we want to hear other podcasts or other writing that you've done, where is all that located?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, ChrystaBilton.com. You can find me on Instagram. You can listen to the book on audio, which is really fun for podcast listeners who like to listen on a commute or something. I recently discovered Libro, which is an alternate to Audible that gives money. It shares the profits of the audiobook with local bookstores, which is pretty cool. So if you're an audio listener, definitely try that. And I love hearing from readers. So if you read the book and want to write me, please do.
That's great. And thank you for sharing. All right. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.